Today is May 29th, 2018. I'm Adrienne Falaise here with Ellen Hawley for the Interviews in Oral History of Television, and we're here in White Plains, New York. Okay, thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Ellen.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So we'd like to start just by getting a bit of background information. So the first question is, what was your name at birth?
Ellen
Your full name.
Virginia Hawley.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in New York, in Queens, in Richmond Hill, a place called Richmond Hill.
And
in
when?
Queens. Oh, 1931.
1931.
Yeah.
And did you grow up in the New York area as well?
Yes, yes. Most of our friends lived in New York, so we made the trip to New York often. Yeah.
And what were your parents' names and what did they do for a living?
William and Grace Hawley, and they remain the most fascinating people I've ever met. I adore my parents. My mother, she was the first person that made magic for us as children. We lived across the street from a school, and we would come home from school for lunch. The door would be open. We'd go into the kitchen where she'd have places set for my sister Jean. I have a sister, one sister, Jean. And Jean and I, the places would be set at both sides of the table. And then my mother would take a place by the stove and start reading to us from books. A Tale of Two Cities, The King of the Golden River, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. It was gorgeous, and she created such magic for us that years later, when I wrote my autobiography, way in 1996, and we're talking about 1931 and 32, the early days, after a beginning preface, I began chapter 1 with my mother reading to us from books.
Were you an avid reader when you were young?
Yes, because of her. Yes, because I, not only then, but all along, even as I tackled acting here and there, whenever it looked like it was going to go out of grabbing distance or whatever, the backup always was getting involved with books and libraries. And when I was terminated at the very end of the soap, I took a civil service. I was 54. I took a civil service exam, and I was lucky. I came up with out at 98.2, which was the highest one, mind you. After all these years of no academic whatever, which made it possible for me to do something that made the rest of my life really gorgeous. Not well paid. I only made $36, $36,000 a year. But I worked right here at the White Plains Local Library for a gorgeously wonderful woman who is at the head of the entry, the first people you come across, the clerks and treat you. And she brought us up like a family. And Gloria Furneaux was her name, and I am glad to talk about her because she made the last part of my working lifetime a joy. We were all like sisters, and when we see each other after all these years, we all hug each other and say, "Oh, what are you doing?" And that's how wonderful she was, and it made the last part of my working lifetime just glorious.
That's lovely.
Like I said, you know.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about your father. What did he do for a living?
Oh, my father. My father was brilliant. We were very fortunate to begin with. We came up in a family that had, and people don't know about, we were not singular in any way. I mean, there are all kinds there are thousands of people black people who have the same history. It's just that people don't know about it. My father came from a family that had been, first of all, let me make it clear. Both my mother and my father, I am very proud to say, were descended from slaves. We're proud of that. because we have a real sense of Black history and what Black people have really done in this country. Not what's in the books, but what they've really done in this country. So it's something to be enormously proud of. And my family, as I said, was not unusual in the circles in which we traveled. We were middle class going all the way back to the 1700s. And about 6 of my ancestors are in history books because they were actively political. And we count back to, on my father's side of the line. Well, before I go into that, let me tell you about my father. Because he was brought up in a family where he was privileged all the way. He went to Brooklyn Polytechnic, and he became a chemical engineer. And even when he was at Brooklyn Polytechnic, he was somebody special because he headed the orchestra. First of all, he had terrific marks, and then he was in his junior year, he was, because he played a classical violin that sounded like, have you ever listened to Nadia Salerno Sonnenberg, the concert artist? Well, she's a very famous concert artist. And then she's a woman, and she plays that's what my father sounded like, so in his junior year. But he did something else that was remarkable, I think. I could show you the book for his junior year there. He's on a page with 2 other guys on each side of him, and they all have their listings of their names, their nicknames. And my father's nickname is Sarge, because my father, even though he knew he was a genius, when he was in his junior year, he was prepared, and this is how brave my father was. His nickname is Sarge because he had volunteered to enlist in the SATC, which is the Student Army Training Corps, with the understanding that when he graduated, he was going to put the golden career he knew he was going to have on hold and go overseas and fight in the trenches of World War I. I have my father's discharge from the Army because he was ready to stop, even though he didn't need the job. He was ready to fight for this country in the trenches of the world. I have my father's, in going through all of our records, I found my father's 2 things. His honorable discharge from the Army. He was only 19 when he was honorably discharged from the Army. And then he made, even though he became a very famous chemist in his field, and I'm going to go into that, he always was involved with the military. And as a citizen later, he became involved with the New York State Guard and became the lieutenant commander in command of the 13th Separate Battalion. I think it was the 13th Separate Battalion, or 3rd Separate Battalion, one of them, of the New York State Guard. He was the commander of that whole thing. Anyway, in terms of what he did, he was very fortunate because he worked, and I think it was very critical for what they were willing to do. He worked for 2 Jewish brothers called S.H. and I. Berg, who were smart enough to know that my father was a genius and to turn over the entire plant operation of Gypsy Paint and Varnish to William Hawley. My father had control of everything. He had control of the labs. He had control of the factory floor. He had so many innovations in just what happened on the floor. But in terms of what happened in the lab, he was the first chemist to use titanium pigment in paint. And he had created a whole spectrum of lacquers and glosses that were so revolutionary. They were taken up by DuPont and Nemours and all the big chemical giants. And anybody in the protective coatings industry in my father's day would have known who my father was. And he had an obit in the New York Times when it was all over. And on top of that, he was a wonderful father. The only mistakes that he made was he brought us up like little soldiers. He was kind of military the way he was a father, but my father was fantastic. And my mother, so was my mother. Um, they were interesting. They had a very traditional marriage. And my mother came to New York after she graduated from the Minnesota U. And she worked at, my Aunt Anna, who is one of the people I'm going to go into because she was the public figure I'll go into later on. Her sister, she came to live with her Anna Arnold Hedgeman, which was her sister, who introduced her to my father, incidentally. But she began working at something quite wonderful. It was the first black orphanage in existence, and it was in Riverdale. And my mother taught orphans, black kids who had lost both of their parents, and they couldn't have had a better mother. Anyway, my father didn't want her to work. And just to give you some idea of my mother, she wrote a poem once. And I'm not sure I can remember it exactly. I'll try to remember it. She called it Recompense. And I'll try to remember it because it tells you who she is. Sometimes the part I'm playing seems so small. It's hardly worth the effort of it all. A poet shapes a dream, and fame is his. A singer sings a song the whole world hears. The whole world hears. Fame has so long since passed on by my door. I never even listen anymore. All day I see pots hanging in a row and beds to make and holes to mend and sew. And if sometimes in the soft glow of night I think perhaps I see a faint and glimmering light and think perhaps it's not too late, deep in my heart, I know this is my fate. A floor swept clean, a faucet made to shine, two faces scrubbed and glistening raised to mine, and in my quiet eyes 'twill not be guessed that I have known desire or unrest. That's my mother, 40 or 50 years before women's lib. So she called the poem Recompense, and she got half of the great bargain you could have, a wonderful husband and children, but no way to be the gifted person she wanted to be. And as for my father, when he played the violin, that sounded so much like Nadia Solar, I realized that there was a soft part of my father that he felt unable to express, except when he was playing the violin.
Wow.
So they were both traditional, but they both realized there was some part of their lives that they were just extraordinary parents.
What traits do you think you inherited from them?
Oh, for one thing, I don't know what the traits might be, but I do know what the moral compass would be. Our lives were always simple because we were brought up with a whole ethic that just serves you for the rest of your life. And it was, you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You do not lie, cheat, or steal upon pain of death. You finish what you start. You do your very best. You say, please, thank you, excuse me, to soothe the possible abrasiveness of human exchange. It just stands you in good stead for the rest of your life. You don't have to worry about remembering the tale you tell Monday so that you can tell it Thursday. It gets you through life very simply, and always underneath it, in terms of my family, going all the way back those 10 generations that we count, public service, and above all, public service to your own race. We could have been brought up like little debutantes in an elite world who thought they were cute or what. We were not we were brought up. That was part of what went wrong further down the line for me. And that is, at the core of it was always, we were the lucky ones. You were born with 90% of the work done for you by the circumstances in which you were born. That gives you a lifetime obligation to make sure that black people who have not had your good luck have a chance in a country that has mixed feelings about our being here. So we came up with what was really a lifetime burden in a way. It can be looked at as a lot of things. It can be looked at as a burden, or it can be looked at as really what should be. So anyway, to go into that life, that pushback, it's interesting to me because I remember in Richmond Hill when I got on the bus for the first time to go to Hunter College, there was I was hanging from the straps, so there was there was no way of getting away from her. And she looked up at me and she said, "Why don't you?" I had long black hair then. She said, "Why don't you go back where you came from?" And I didn't know what to say. But it bothered me the way a grain of sand goes into an oyster. And I thought to myself, if I heard that once, I'm going to hear it again. And I better have an answer. And I had an answer the next time. The next time it happened, it wasn't on the bus. It was at a kiosk in Grand Central. And the woman said to me, why don't you go back where you came from? I said, I'm a Shinnecock Indian. Why don't you? And from there on, that's all I said. But I am a quarter Shinnecock. And here's how I am a quarter Shinnecock. I'm going to start talking to you. Can I start talking to you about my family tree?
Sure, yeah. We'll get into your interests,
because
too.
really, you know, my aunt, the 6 people that I talk about as moving the ball forward, which is for black people, which is what we're supposed to do. Well, Anna, I'll talk about separately because she's on my mother's side. My mother has another whole tale to tell. Here's my father's line of descent. It's a long one. You better be ready for it.
Okay.
My great, 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 great grandfather was an African prince who is a child of 10, was kidnapped, brought over on a slave ship that because it was carrying cargo as well as human beings, stopped at Montauk Point and dropped anchor as its first port of call. Now, whether it was because he was only 10 years old, so his wrists and things would be able to get out of chains, or whether his tribesmen, because of who he was, all colluded to help him escape. He went over the side in the dead of night and swam to shore and hid out in the forest, where he was found the following day by a woman who was a Shinnecock Indian called Libby. In some history books, she's called Libby Larkins. In other history books, she's called Sibby Larkin. And it is from that line, wait a minute. He was brought up as a chore boy initially, but he became so beloved of the family. Sibby had 2 children, 2 girls, Jerusha and Sylvia. They called him Solomon because he was a prince in the name, as named after King Solomon. And he married Sylvia, her daughter Sylvia. The only record they have of that marriage, there's in the Queens County land records, and I still want to go there and find them one of these days, but the only record of that marriage is Queens County land records have the purchase of land on Hempstead Plain from those 2 as they bought land from Cornelius Van Wyck, the same Wyck as Van Wyck Expressway, Van Wyck Boulevard, etc., etc. That's the only thing that we have on record of that marriage. But once his daughter, Charlotte, gave birth to Sylvanus Smith. His grandson, Sylvanus Smith. From Sylvanus Smith, there is a descent that I'll go into. Sylvanus Smith was the beginning of, I should say, financial, and he was wealthy. He was a free black, he was a pork merchant, and he also owned land. And Sylvanus Smith was responsible for Weeksville. Are you aware of Weeksville? Weeksville is it's sort of like a museum. People were doing some digging in Brooklyn, and they came across what was a 19th century black town called Weeksville, and he was a part of being responsible for building it, and it's now a museum. And they have two of the houses that were there. Anyway, Sylvanus Smith was an abolitionist. And recently, in 2007, 2006, 2000, the Brooklyn Historical Society had an exhibit that went into the beginning black revolutionaries and abolitionists, and Sylvanus was there. They had a whole thing on Sylvanus Smith. Sylvanus Smith had a number of children. Two of them would become very, very important. He put my great-grandmother, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, I'm going to start with her. That was my great-grandmother. He sent her to medical school. She became the first black woman to graduate from medical school in New York, the third in the country. There were two others that had preceded her. And this is 1870, she graduated from the New York Medical School and Hospital for Women. They called her down to the office. They told her that because of her marks, she was the valedictorian of her otherwise white class. And in the next breath, almost as a matter of course, they explained it as it would be unseemly, that was the verb that they used, for her to address the audience, that the white student who had come in second would be the salutatorian, would be giving the address. And then they started to go on to something else, and she said, "Oh, no, I'm the valedictorian. I'm going to be giving the valedictory." Well, they couldn't believe it, and they kept her down there like a common criminal, trying to make her change her mind, and she made it clear that she wasn't going to, and that she was prepared to take it outside of the class, or rather the room where she was, and make it an issue, a community issue. And so they deferred to the trouble they wanted to avoid, and she gave the address. But just imagine, I mean, there are people whose hearts beat a little faster when they're getting up to talk to the PTA about something. Public speaking is not easy. Yeah. Here she is in 1870, a black woman, and out front is a shocked white audience that can't believe what they're looking at, and behind you a hostile faculty. Anyway, she became a very famous physician, and also very political, but political in terms of gender rather than race. She wrote a book called Women in Medicine, and she spoke at conferences here and abroad. She'd go abroad and speak about women in medicine. She founded the Equal Suffrage League of Brooklyn. She founded the Women's Local Union. And as a result of all of her political activity, there are a number of institutions in Brooklyn today that are named after her. Junior High School 265 is named after my great-grandmother. What is the other thing that's... there's a gorgeous... it's the Susan Smith McKinney nursing home, a gorgeous building on Albany Avenue that is named after her. And one of her daughters was my grandmother, my father's mother. Anna. Well, her married name was Anna Cardy, and then Anna this and Anna that. But that was my grandmother. And another of his daughters, Sylvana Smith, in addition to Susan being one of his daughters, was Susan's sister, Minsera, who also is an educated woman, persuaded the Board of Education to open the first black school for children, and she became the principal of the school. She had to get a special pass to be able to ride the horse car to her school. The horse car was a trolley that was pulled by horses. That's how far back it goes. And she married, both of them married clerics, and both of them had second husbands too, because the first ones died. Anyway, she married Henry Highland Garnet, who is probably the most famous of all of these people. Henry Highland Garnet was, the way he came into the situation is interesting, because he was the child of a family of slaves that managed to escape from a plantation by pretending that they were going to a funeral. And they were always being chased by slave chasers throughout their lives. Anyway, he managed to get his son, Sylvanus, his son, Henry Highland Garnet, an education. He went to the African Free School, he went to an academy, and then he went to the seminary and became a public person. He had a congregation in Troy, New York. And what he is famous for is a whole bunch of stuff. For one thing, at the 1843 Buffalo Colored Citizens Convention against slavery, which was the first black abolitionist thing, he was the orator who was remembered, even though that was also the first time that Frederick Douglass went to a black thing. And it is my uncle's or the speech that is the one that goes down in history. Henry Louis Gates Jr. will tell you that he speaks of my uncle again and again, but as the Malcolm X to Frederick Douglass's Martin Luther King, because my uncle was the one who gave the call to rebellion. And what it says was, we are 4 million strong, better to die free men than live to be slaves. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. Anyway, he and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth often talked to Abraham Lincoln. Wow. And he knew Abraham Lincoln so well that when they had the memorial for Lincoln on his birthday, way back in that time, he was the first black to address Congress at the Lincoln Memorial, because he had been so part of speaking to him. And he became the American consul to Liberia. He was a whole bunch of stuff.
It's remarkable.
Yes, it is remarkable.
Wow.
So those two girls, and anyway, my father, though, that was his aunt and uncle, and all that. It goes all the way back. So
incredible lineage.
Oh, and then my father's father, my grandmother, knew James Theodore Holly. That's where the Holly name comes. James Theodore Holly is where the Holly name comes from. James Theodore Holly was the first black bishop of the American succession of the Protestant Episcopal Church. He was ordained down here in Wall Street, and by virtue of his ordination, he was invited by the Archbishop of Canterbury to go to speak, give the sermon in Westminster Abbey on the Feast of St. James, after which, by royal command, he was introduced to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. And what I thought it absolutely fascinated me when in the wedding of recent wedding of Harry,
The royal wedding?
the royal
And
wedding that we just looked at.
Yeah, Meghan Markle.
Here is Meghan Markle, a mixed person like I am. As the car left, it passed around the Victoria statue, the statue of Queen Victoria. And as she was passing around Queen Victoria dead in the statue, I was thinking that my uncle saw her living and met her. It was absolutely fascinating. Anyway.
Amazing.
That's James Theodore Holly. He became a missionary bishop in Haiti and set up the Protestant Episcopal Church in Haiti. And he had about 5 or 6 sons. His son Louis was he came to this country and met my grandmother because Susan Smith McKinney Stewart knew James Theodore Holly, the bishop. So when his son came so he went to my great-grandmother's brownstone. And my grandmother came downstairs and already fell in love with him because she could hear the music. He was a concert pianist. Hear the music of this concert pianist kid. And she came down and she met him. And he went on to the School of Music, the Boston School of Music, because he was going there because he was a pianist. And got along so well they wanted to write to each other. So they started writing to each other. Louis Holly, James Theodore, the bishop's son in Haiti, and my grandmother as Susan Smith McKinney's daughter, they started writing to each other. And they got engaged, and then there was a question of getting married, so the marriage was set up, both of the parents approved and whatever, and so the family came over here and came to the brownstone, and there he sits, and she comes downstairs, and the person that she sees get up off of the couch is totally different than she thought he was. And she wanted to get out of it, and they would not let her. And so they went ahead with they wouldn't let her. They said, we've given our word. This has to go through. So but she was horrified. And on top of that, to make it even drearier, a beloved aunt had just died. So everybody came to the wedding with black armbands around their arms. And she married somebody to the long story short, when she got over there, she found herself surrounded by this wonderful family where this person was the one rotten arrow. He was horrendous. He was abusive, physically abusive. He was demeaning. He slept with all kinds of, he would go various places and sleep with all kinds of women. And it became so horrible that on one night when he came home drunk and smacked his kid, Louis, that was the end of it. And so my mother, my grandmother, got her mother, fortunately we knew the consul, my family knew the consul. So they arranged to meet in a church and make plans for her to escape. So on the pretext of going to a party, she escaped in a carriage where she had pinned all of Louis's diapers to the insides of her dress. And pregnant with my father, she fled to New York. And of course, the family tried to get him back. But that was my father's history on his father's side.
Just incredible.
So it's one after the next after the next.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about your background in New York. You said you went to Hunter College?
Yes.
So what did you study at Hunter?
I I knew I had to start getting close to something that I wanted to do, because I knew I wanted to work. I majored in art because I could draw, and I thought I wanted to be a painter, and that even if it didn't work, I could work as in a museum with fine arts or whatever and so on. And I minored in speech and drama. And I had done some fooling around with acting and stuff in high school, but here, most of the stuff that I did, I was behind the scenes. I worked on crew and constructed crew, the things. It was only in my final year there, in my senior year, I was given the opportunity to design a set. So I designed a set for a fascinating kind of strange story called Music at Night by J.B. Priestley. It's really a stunning storyline. Anyway, I designed the set, and somebody on the faculty called Charlotte Perry, I thought it was remarkable. So she offered me a scholarship she was very famous, and I knew her. I never had her as a professor, but I knew her because she was famous for having this jewel of a theater camp, a summer camp all about theater, way across the country in the West, near Denver, up in the mountains in some place called Steamboat Springs. And she offered me a scholarship there. And I told her I didn't want a scholarship. I used to, instead of going to the beach, I used to work in the summer. And for instance, in a factory, I used to paint a rose on the bottom of a lamp. I could do a lamp in 1 minute. I could do 60 lamps, so I had a bank account. And this sounded like such a golden opportunity. I wanted every minute of it. I didn't want to have to leave to go on KP. I didn't want to have to wait table and do the things you had to do with a work scholarship. So I said, no, I'll go. She said, all right, you want to pay full freight, help yourself. So anyway, I went there, and I started, in the course of everything else, taking acting classes. And she said, wait a minute. Miss Perry got it in her head that I was not just a good actress. She thought I was a major American actress. And I was initially unhinged by it. Because I felt like it was such an enormous thing to live up to. She was famous for having discovered Julie Harris, one of the two great women of the stage, between Julie Harris and Kim Stanley were the two major actresses that were ahead of me, had preceded me in theater. She thought that for the second time in her life she had found a major American actress, and that woman believed that till the day she died. It was extraordinary. But I was terrified by it because I thought it, and then something happened that was absolutely critical. I decided, why not? All right, disappoint her. Give yourself the right to fail. And I gave myself the right to disappoint her and to fail, and I was just going to go ahead with this thing wherever it took me. Miss Perry, I did exactly what she told me to do. As soon as we got back in September, I had graduated by then. I took a course in steno in night school to legitimately become a student at Hunter College, and she put me in one thing after the next, after the next, after the next. She put me in Electra in Daughters of Atreus, that tragedy, the Greek tragedy. Then Tituba in the Crucible, then Olivia in Climate of Eden. And we started getting takers, and I was astonished because some of them were, they wanted, the Hammersteins were interested in having me for Finian's Rainbow, and I thought about that, I knew I couldn't do that. So I took the thing that was most comfortable for me in all kinds of ways, in the sense that I also knew that as a black actress, I would have a different road than the average. So this was in Greenwich Village, where it didn't matter whether you were black or white or green or plaid or gay or straight or whatever. So that was off anything I had to worry about. And in terms of diversity, this was so amusing. This was a company that got free space in the basement of a building that was a synagogue on Saturday. an Episcopal church on Sunday, and here in the basement is this company that has an Arab called Alan Ansara, brilliant in performance as a Nazi officer in The Private Life of the Master Race, a drop-dead gorgeous Greek blonde called Janine Manadas, and a number of blacks who would become major stars later. And I was there for 2 minutes when the most extraordinary thing happened to me. I read a story by Alan Paton, a South African author, called Too Late, the Phalarope. Phalarope is a shorebird that can lose its way and wander inland, and because the terrain is different, die. And Paton uses that as the metaphor for a South African man called Peter van Vlaanderen, who loses his way in that he becomes involved with a native girl. And the reason he does, first of all, he belongs to a family that is the family patriarch and one of the pillars of the support in the community. They are all, and he's been to Stellenbosch and all the right schools, and he has he has a wife who loves him, but she is repelled by the physical side of marriage. So he starts looking at some other things in his life. And there is this girl called Stephanie. She lives in the bush. She's very young. She has a child that she takes care of. And there's an old woman, very old woman, that she takes, the three of them, she takes care of them by doing the only thing she knows how to do. And that is to run a still and make liquor that she sells. That's how she keeps herself alive. Well, it's illegal to do that. So he will shut her down as the head of police. And she will lay low for a while, but because it's the only thing she knows how to do, she will have to wait a while, and then she'll set up another still, and he'll shut her down. And then the whole thing. So it's almost like a leitmotif in music where it keeps going back to that thing. And Paton always ends it by saying, and then she walked away from him with a walk that was almost a dance. And I read the thing, and this is something that happened to me that never ever happened to me ever again. But it's almost as if she came off of the page and said to me, if this is ever made into a play or a film, I want you to play me because you're the only one who knows how to do it. The fact that he didn't go into what was in her head made me angry, because I knew what she was feeling every bit of the way. And even though he was everybody else was explained in terms of, oh, his aunt thought this and was worried about that and so on. And he uses her like as if she's a deus ex machina, the god in the she's the one that makes all this happen. Later on, I would think that was brilliant. But the point is, I knew what she was thinking, and I knew how, I knew every other actress, every little starlet was going to do with, I knew what they were going to do with her. You know, she's not Stormy Daniels, who is aware of her assets. She's this little girl in the bush, for goodness sakes, who doesn't know that she doesn't know what he sees in her. So a friend of mine had started working at William Morris agency, and he said, he wanted me to meet an agent that he called, an agent named Bruce Savan, who was a big deal at the agency. Bruce Savan was very upfront about it. He said, I'm sure she's as remarkable as you think she is, but there are no roles for black actresses. I can't get her hired. Well, what's the point of signing her when I can't get her a job? So I said, look, I just read in Variety that there's a woman called Mary Franklin who is about to produce a play called Too Late, the Phalarope. There's a role in it that I know that I'm right for. You don't have to do anything for me, but send me for that one thing. He says, oh, all right, no. It took a year for that thing to be in Variety. And then they started looking at people. So I went to Bruce Van. He came through. I'm sitting in front of John Sticks. No, absolutely not, you, says he too. You're over there where I was over there. And he says, no, there's no way. You don't look please, forget it. I'm sorry. I'm not going to. So I had, under ordinary circumstances, I have always taken no for an answer. This is the one time I did not. I sat down, I wrote him a letter. I said, you look at that thing again. Nobody knows what's going on in her head. I do. You better start talking to me because I know what she's doing every minute of that thing. And Sticks, the letter, he came back. He said, look, we're going to California. We're going to look at people. If I don't see anybody, I'll talk to you. Okay, they didn't find anybody. He talked to me. He said, I don't know what you can do. I know they think you're marvelous. I'd like to see a scene. So I grabbed somebody I knew. I came in. We did the scene. And then it was all of a sudden, oh, here's a script. So I did the audition. And then they really got interested. And they said to me, you do another. Now we know you can do it. But you've got to look it. You go out there and you come back and do an audition and convince us that you look like a girl in the African bush. Okay, that's where my father came in. I went to Gray's drugstore. Gray's was a drugstore in Times Square where all the girls went, even the ones that had to do body makeup, from the girls in the Follies that did the whole body makeup thing. Okay, I tried everything, didn't work. So I talked to my father. My brilliant father made me a makeup so extraordinary that I could make up at home just the way I wanted to look, and get on the subway and go to the appointment in New York, and the person sitting next to me never would have dreamed I was anything but the dark mahogany he was looking at. My father got me that job. And so I got that accomplished. I had 3 weeks until rehearsal. And the reason why I'm talking about this so much is because this play was the highlight of my career. The way I feel, I will always have a feeling that Stephanie was alive. I will always feel uniquely about this thing that happened to me. Okay, I had to go home. And I had 3 weeks. And I knew that it all had to depend on the walk that was almost a dance. Because it couldn't be all of that Hedy Lamarr sliding down the doorway, me Tondaleo, that kind of nonsense. It had to be totally... I went, the only place I could find African women in bulk, I went to the library, I got out a shelf of National Geographics and went through them and I already got the lineup. Here they are. Here they are. Absolutely. Shoulders back, heads like this in an alignment. And I realized it was because they carried these bundles on their heads. So I started walking around my house with books. And I found out that if I walk toe, heel, toe, heel, toe, heel, and that in the pelvis, because that's the only thing that's free, that's the one that makes the adjustment between left and right as you walk forward, that the thing, I could keep more books on my head, and that it looked very sexy, even though I didn't. The girl is not doing that on purpose. That's the way it works for, okay, once I found the walk, from the moment I got up in the morning until the moment I went to bed at night, I never walked any other way. And I didn't walk any other way until the play closed. I mean, that's the way I walked all the time. So by the time I got to rehearsal, that was all second nature. I went into that thing because I was so blinkered about her, somehow or other, by displacing my sense of myself to my sense of her, saving her, making her work. I got so blinkered, I was able to walk into a rehearsal that was full of so much. It was, even though it was going into the Belasco, which was it was done on the range of a musical. here was it's going to be an enormous cast of African Americans and singing, and there's going to be a full orchestra. And the thing is got all kinds of huge stars. It's got Finley Curry, for goodness sakes, who just got finished doing A Great Expectations. It's got Alan Napier, another huge English star, as the head of the police department. And it's got Barry Sullivan as Peter van Vlaanderen. And the first time I had the first crack in my sense of single-minded what I was doing was when we opened in Philadelphia and things weren't quite right, and I would go to a rehearsal, and all of a sudden, somebody'd be gone, and somebody else would be in their place. Then a couple of days later, somebody'd be gone, and somebody would be in their place. Alan, then something happened that I will remember for the rest of my life, to my grave. Barry Sullivan, who came in, he was always all work. He had never said one thing to me that was personal. You know how you will say to somebody, did you get to go to that basketball game with your kid the other day? When you never anything like that. Simple man, simple clothes, do the work. No posse to keep shining up his ego, no hangers-on trying to, just him and his work. He never said boo to me outside of he came over and he sat down beside me and he said to me, I want you to know, I think you're one of the most talented people I've ever worked with. Well, my God, to this day that brings tears to my eyes, because when the star of the show, you get the good housekeeping seal of approval from the star of the show, what that man did made it possible for me to drop everything and get back on track and do the best Stephanie that I could do. When we got to Boston, got great reviews, and Elliot Norton wrote a special column about the two performances he had seen a week or two later, that he had seen that season, that he thought should have special mention. One was, the male was Morris Evans in The Apple Cart he was the great Shakespearean actor of the time, doing George Bernard Shaw. The other one was Ellen Holly, and the gist of the thing was, this is a new person we've never seen before. Look out for her, she's brilliant. Okay, so we opened in New York. There are 7 critics. I was the only one in that entire operation that got a thumbs up from all 7. From Walter Kerr's rave to Tom and the Telegram, he wasn't having it. He didn't believe it for a minute, and he liked nobody on that thing. I was the only one that he thought was interested in, but from all 7. What was so unfortunate is that at the time, Walter Kerr was writing for the Tribune. Brooks Atkinson was writing for the Times. And he was much more staid and much more this and that. Yes, there's some wonderful acting, but, and this but, and that but. It was so, but finally it rises to this. Kerr's review was astonishing. From start to finish, Walter Kerr was for my money, Walter Kerr was the greatest critic we ever had. Not because he gave me one wonderful thing after another in my career, but because when I didn't have the money to go and I wanted to know what another actress was doing, all I had to do was make sure I read the Kerr review. I still remember I wanted to see Kim Stanley in something. I didn't have the money. Walter Kerr said, imagine remembering a piece of the thing somebody wrote that far, all these years later. He said, Kim Stanley plays the part as if she had waked up on Christmas morning and found out there's no Santa Claus. Immediately I knew what she was doing. He gave us one of the most extraordinary reviews you'd ever want to see. He thought it was brilliant. He got everything, and he writes so compellingly that even if, anyway. but he was writing for the Tribune. If it had been switched, we would have been a huge, anyway. The thing, the closing notice went up. It was just too expensive. There was no way. They had to sell out, or there was just no way that they were going to. So the closing notice went up. 4 weeks later, we're going to close. And we did. However, and this is critical, everybody in the industry, and I'm not just talking about the royalty of the New York Theater, I'm talking about all the movie companies that had New York offices and what have you and so on. Everybody in the industry got the message that something remarkable was going down the drain. And all of a sudden, our last week was almost frightening, because I don't know where the fire department was. I don't know where anybody was, because if there had been a fire, it would have been a catastrophe, because everybody was breaking the rules. When you went out stage, it was almost kind of scary, because in the thing that partitions the last row of the orchestra, there would be people standing 3 deep behind the thing. You would look up in the boxes, and there were people standing 2 and 3 deep behind the people who were sitting in the boxes. I couldn't even see the lights on the stairway going up to the balcony and the mezzanine, because people were sitting all over the steps. And then it closed.
Wow.
But it did so much for me. It did everything for me, because for one thing, that whole business of being a black actress and desperately wanting to market yourself as a black actress, you have to get it straight with this person and this person and this person and this person. And throughout my life, even just remember the time I told you about painting the things on the
lamps.
On the lamps.
Mm-hmm.
About 8 weeks into that situation, somebody asked me what I was, and I said Negro, American Negro, which is the way we were taught to answer when we were children. I think our parents knew that there would be people asking us about that when they weren't there, and they wanted to get that American in there. So I said Negro, American Negro, and the woman was shocked and whatever and so on. And they thought they sorted out in terms of how they felt about it, which one wanted to continue to know me and who wanted to stop talking to me. And a number of them thought I was trying to pass for white. All these horrible things. So I knew that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to stay in the entertainment business, because I'll show you the difference. Whenever I was in the workaday world, I had to do this. When I was in the entertainment industry, it was all about talent, and that is, so you never had to do this. And if it was any other place, in a 9 to 5, so-and-so, clerking or whatever, I'd have to make it clear in the first week what I was, so I didn't have to go through that whole thing of people deciding this or that or whatever. Get it all clear, so whoever wanted to say hello and whoever who wanted to stop. So I'd find a way to, and of course you can't say to somebody, by the way, I'm Negro. What I would say was, if it were winter, I'd say, well, as a Negro, I was born for warmer climes. I can't stand this weather. And everybody would go, ah! And get over there, whatever they're going to get over. And the ones who didn't care, fine, and the ones that did. It had all sorted itself out so I could know what I was working, Or they'd say, they'd be talking about movie stars, and I would say, well, as a Negro, I like people who look a little more exotic, so I like Gene Tierney. I'd have to make it clear in the first week so it'd all sort itself out. There's so much stuff you have to go through. What it did was, it made it clear to everybody in the industry, this is a black product. Don't get mixed up just because I look like I do. And it got it straight with everybody, and for the rest of my life, I would sit in somebody's office, and they would say, you're here, because I saw you in Fowler.
So you were asked to join the Actors Studio around 1960?
Yes, it wasn't even my audition. I didn't even know how much it was. Elie Kazan, Lee Strasberg, it was a friend of mine. He was a white guy, and he was a young character actor, so he didn't want to do Stanley. He wanted to do Mitch in the Moonlight Casino scene, in Streetcar. You remember that scene?
It's been a while.
It's been a while, yes, okay. It's when she's talking about her young husband, Alan Gray, and she says, he was a boy, just a boy, when I was a very young girl. When I was 16, I fell in love all at once, much too completely. That one. He asked me to do the scene with him. So we did it. He didn't get it, but I got a phone call. And I was told that they thought that my Blanche was so remarkable, they wanted me to count the audition as their own, as my own, so that they could take me into the studio. That Elia Kazan, Lee Strasberg, and Cheryl Crawford were stunned by it, and they hoped that I would. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to say no way. So here, here I am at 26. This was Fowler Opus 25. Here I am at 26. And I'm sitting in this. First of all, Lee would teach in this enormous room. It was a huge room. And at the back, it was like a theater balcony with pillars. And then the orchestra, this is where the class sat. And Lee would sit over here, and you would do your scene out there and all that huge thing. Anyway, so here I am, green as grass. And there's Jane Fonda. And there's Shelley Winters. And there's the
Steve McQueen,
leaning against a pillar. Cool, he really was cool. I mean, it wasn't a fake. That's what he was, all that. And quiet as a mouse, so that you could hardly even, I don't think anybody was even aware he was there. Taking notes in town to do some Shakespeare on Broadway, and so fascinated by the method. There he is, Sir Laurence Olivier taking notes. That's a regular day at the studio. And I was, the thing that distressed me was I was on tour when Marilyn Monroe did her first scene. She had just come to New York, where Lee was being Svengali, who was going to make Trilby sing, and she was just about to marry Arthur Miller. And everybody was waiting to get into that class to see her first. And I was on tour, but a friend of mine sat next to her, and he said, "Oh, she's so perfect. Even her feet are perfect." Who knew he had a foot fetish? Anyway, it was just amazing. Absolutely.
So what did you learn about the craft, about acting from being there?
What did I learn? You'd be surprised what I learned. I learned I wanted to have nothing to do with Lee Strasberg as a teacher. I mean, I was thrilled to be there in the studio and listen and watch and whatever and so on, because I know my instrument. And he had a reputation of, and this is fascinating, taking people apart and then putting them back together. That was his reputation. And some people got put back together and become something wonderful, and other people never got it together ever again. And one thing I know about my instrument, because of what I am, because there are so many more gears and things that open up. For instance, if you walk, let me put it this way. If you walk through life and you don't even know the doors that open, so that you walk through, it's one thing that you experience. If you belong to a group of people who have to give their passport and their resume and their this and their every time to get the door to open, there are things that happen inside of you that you don't need sense memory to go back and feel heard about this. You don't need sense, but you have a whole bunch in that Santa Claus bag that every performer carries on their back. I felt, who was Bush's, that guy who was Dan?
Quayle?
Dan Quayle, yes. He's wealthy, he's male, he's blonde, he's white, he's this and he's that. That can be a tragedy if you're an actor, because it means that it's like exercising and pushing against a table. If you have nothing to push against, you don't develop muscles. Everything's all laid out for him, so he becomes a shallow person. If you have to go through something to get somewhere, if something locks you on your back and you have to get up, that's my motto. That's my motto throughout my life. Get up. Nobody, so anyway, I also knew that he was one of those people who was, yes, I admired them all for having a mission. All those people were the royalty of the theater, and they approached the thing as almost as you approach a religion. But there are also people who use that position and they become a guru, and you are a believer. And he would do a couple of things to me, like pass by me and make a point, not of saying hello, of ignoring that. And I spoke to a guy I knew about it. He said, "Oh, that's Lee doing his number. Don't worry about it. He does that to everybody." But so I never took it personally. But I realized that this is a person who is, these are the people who end up as the head of cults. The cult of this one, the cult, yeah. So there were a whole lot of reasons why I didn't want to go out on that floor and put my instrument at his disposal to take to pieces, because I knew it was not going to help me. So I stayed clear of him. But I love being there, and I'll be a member of Actors Studio to my grave, and there was so much I could learn from what... and you know, one of the things that is distressing to me, Miriam Colon was a Latina actress who was at the studio. I was so impressed with her work when she was tackling Greek this and that, and I thought she was one of the most brilliant actresses that I would see go out there and work. And I realized she recently died, and she would play Latinas in small roles, and she was never able to use that instrument for what it was worth. And that was devastating to me, that she died and she never became who she would have been. She was a riveting actress when she had the material. Anyway, so that's where the studio went.
Amazing.
Yes, and they're very nice. They called me back and wanted me to come back to class. And so I'll be a member of Actors Studio until I die, which is great. I think it's a fabulous place.
Now, in the early 1960s, you had a few guest appearances on television shows as well. Sam Benedict, Dr. Kildare, Doctors and the Nurses.
Yes.
How were you getting those roles, and what was it like to just come in and do a guest spot on those kinds of shows?
It was difficult because they all were the same. It's interesting that you know that, yes, because it was Ivan Dixon in The Defenders, and then all the three that you mentioned. Let me just talk about Kildare, because that was the last one that would happen for, a long time, for years and years and years. Dr. Kildare opposite, because it's so typical of what would happen to me. I'm in New York. I think Bruce, an agent, set me up for the part. And I'm in New York. They're looking at people. They would set up a hotel room, and then people would come in and read with them. I read for Kildare. They loved the reading. I was reading against brilliant black actresses, like Diana Sands was one of the people who was reading for the thing. And they loved the reading. So they signed me. And then they flew me to Hollywood, put me in the Roosevelt, what is that place they have at the Roosevelt something?
The hotel? Roosevelt Hotel.
It's a hotel, yeah, the Roosevelt Hotel. And then I go on the set for my first day on the show. And I barely get a word out of my mouth. And the cameraman says, "Oh my God." And so the director said, "What's going on? What's the problem?" And he says, "She's photographing lighter than Dick," meaning Dick Chamberlain. So they came over and they looked in the thing. Then they shut down the whole thing. You could hear all the Licos and Fresnels go out while they took me in the makeup room, and they plastered me as much makeup as you could. But you can only go so far without it looking fake, so they plastered me all over with makeup. And the thing is, they are not only there's a whole problem. Anyway, the reason why that was the last time that ever happened, that was what usually happened in these things. That was the last time because tape became so cheap that they stopped doing the auditions in person. They did the auditions on tape so that they knew at once what I was going to look like on a camera, and that I never got anything after that. And you know, the thought is always, there's a whole thing about, a whole problem about black actresses who, well, it's interesting to, do you want to get into typecasting?
Yeah.
In terms of, because I'd like to get into it in terms of typecasting in terms of everybody.
Sure.
It's going to be a couple of minutes. It's
Sure.
going to take a bit of time, but I think it's worth talking about so people know where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Typecasting, everybody, every single performer, white, black, green, brown, whatever, works in a box. And the box usually sells them short because it's a stereotypical. I mean, there are brilliant white male actors who don't have square jaws, so they'll never be leading men. It's because of what they look like. Take even the most successful, take a Tom Cruise, take a Farrah Fawcett. For years, they made tons of money. And the world fell in love with them, but they fell in love with the stereotype. He was a hunk, she was a pinup. The kind of girl you put in, if you're a soldier overseas, she's the girl you put in your locker. It took years for him to play Ron Kovic. He had to mess up his face and sit in a wheelchair and play Ron Kovic, born in the 4th of July, for people to say, oh my God, he can act. Who'd have thought it? He can act. Same thing for her. She had to age. She had to get wrinkles. She had to play roles that were more complex, more everything, more depth, and keep knocking it out of the park for people to say, my Lord, she was an actress, a real one. Who'd have thought it? And even in terms of who you are, outside in the world out there, Dina Merrill was the daughter of Marjorie Merriweather Post. In the acting world, they had people in her social world were excited by who she was and who she was. In the theater world, she was Dina Merrill, and she was cared about in terms of the talent, who she was, what she could do. In the entertainment world, you can be all the things that they tell you are no-nos in real life. You can't be short, you can't be black, you can't be Jewish, you can't have one eye. If you're Sammy Davis, you can be an icon. That's the entertainment world. That's how different it is from everything else. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it's great to get in there. But then you work in the box. Of all the, Antonio Sabato, not Antonio Sabato, and Antonio Banderas, at one point in time on James Lipton's show about Actors Studio, he said that he felt boxed in by being a leading man, that many is the time that he's playing the straight, that the guy who's playing the villain has more fun and the better part. You know, everybody works in the box, but nobody works in a smaller box than a black actress. That's because we have to go through 2 filters, not just one. For the Latinas, it's, are you white or are you Latina? And if you're not white, there will be fewer roles for you as a Latina. And for the Asian Americans, it's going to be, are you Asian American or are you white? And if you're Asian American, it's going to be a problem. And if you're, are you black or are you, it's going to be a problem. Now, in my day, there were only tokens for each one of those categories. I can tell you just who the people were, because those people managed to make their names famous for whatever reason, and then they were the go-to girls for everything else. And when those things came up, the 2 Latinas in my era were Cari Gerardo in Westerns and Rita Moreno. That was the ball game. Those are the girls they always went to. Same thing with the Asian Americans. Both of these girls had gained visibility in the world of Susie Wong, and it became so famous that Nancy Kwan and France Nguyen became the two Latinas. In my era, the one black who ever, in my generation, ever became an A-list star was Cicely Tyson. The only one. And in 1981, Cicely would end up with 6. The Image Awards that are given by the NAACP are really literally the Black Oscars. She's had 5 of them. She's won 5 of them. In 1981 and 1991, they couldn't give her any because there were no other actresses. She was the only one to play a role in a black movie that year. So they couldn't even drum up the 2 or 3 other actresses to place beside her so they could get a category for her to win from. Now, let me go on and say, if we were to have only one, even I, because I'm political, I wouldn't have picked me either. If we're only going to have one, I think she was marvelous. It was a marvelous choice. I'm so glad she was there. And because we couldn't have had a better. And one of the highlights of my life was to see a black president called Barack Obama pin a medal around her neck in the White House. Really, I mean, I can't tell you how much that meant. And she has handled it so gracefully, so gracefully. All of those, I knew all of those people who were out there all by themselves. I knew Sidney Poitier. I knew Lena Horne. I knew Cicely. These were all, Jackie Robinson, I knew. These were all people for whom it's horrible to be the only one out there carrying the burden, because there are millions and millions of black people, and unlike what people think, we are all different. We all have different ideas about different things, and they all think we have one head. Well, we don't. And the person who is there as the token carries the burden of everybody wants them to say what they once said, and they can't do that, but that's the burden they carry. I am so happy about today, if only for the fact that we have a whole bunch of people we have who have reached that level so they can all enjoy being there. But these people who were out there first, it was hell, and they couldn't have done a more graceful job of it. And I feel that way about Cicely. She couldn't have done a more graceful job of being out there as our own. Okay, so there. Now, with all of those actors, with black actors and actresses, we not only have to go through the filter of, are you black rather than white, we have to go through another filter that the others, the Latinos and the Asian Americans, don't have to bother with. All right, what color black are you? What shade of black are you? Because they chop off the 2 ends as you're too dark and you're too light, and they deal with the middle of the spectrum. And some of our biggest stars, like Viola Davis and Lupita Nyong'o, have been wonderfully eloquent, and good for them, about talking about the problems that pertain to actresses who are labeled too dark. They've been wonderful about that. And in my case, there really hasn't been anybody to talk about the business of being too light, because none of them have really gotten to that place yet. Can I say a word about Viola Davis? Well, I saw Viola Davis 20 years before she became famous in a play, or more, in a play called Intimate Apparel by Lynn Nottage. And I couldn't close my mouth. I thought to myself, my God, she's brilliant. I hope she gets the career she deserves. never dreaming that she would. That's another thrilling thing to me in my life, to see her get the career she deserves. She can make everything interesting, even the phone book. I don't know how she does it, but she does it. Anyway, all right, let's get back on my thing. If you're too light. Mm-hmm. If you are so light you photograph like white, then you really have a hard time. Because beneath all that, they tell you, you're not properly representative of your race. But what is really bothering them are the optics, because it looks like you've got a black man working with a white woman. Just the look of it. They're so afraid they're going to offend the sensibilities of the white audience that so it's very much about that and all these other things. But it's this is the box. The only role that you are considered the right thing to play, if you look like me and an army of other women like Janice Kingslow, Hilda Sims, Ginny Booth, Isabel Cooley, and on it goes. It's a long list. Is a black who is passing for white. And in my day, those roles went to white women. Jean Crane played in Pinky. Susan Kohner played in Imitation of Life. What's interesting about that is I read for that. Oh, by the way, Lost Boundaries, which was about a whole family that passed for white, was played by Mel Ferrer and a whole bunch of whites. It was standard practice. I was seeing about Imitation of Life. Ross Hunter, sat back in his chair and he said, "Oh my, you're gorgeous. You look like a black Loretta Young. What? The studio? You're a member of Actors Studio? Oh my goodness. And all these Shakespearean roles you've played? Oh my, my, my." We had this most wonderful conversation, and I thought I left the interview thinking, oh, well, maybe I have a shot. Who knows? Well, anyway, no, I didn't. And they chose Susan Kohner. But the thing that's so interesting is so few of us had viable careers that we all knew each other like a sorority. So we all put our heads together. We found out not a single one of us had ever been given a script to read a line or put a frame of film on the record. So really we understood that he was going to use Susan Kohner all along. And that was a protection, so that if people said to him, well, the first time with Claudette Colbert, when they did it, the woman was the real thing. Freddie Washington was really a black woman who looked like white, who played the role. Why did you hire Susan Kohner? He would be able to say, honestly, well, we looked at black actresses, but we just couldn't find one that was quite right. So he was taken. But there's a wonderful P.S. to that, which is kind of funny. Years later, when I wrote my autobiography, I'm sitting here, and we were in Southampton with a whole bunch of authors, and Rona Jaffe was to my right. I forget the guy who was to my left. But Rona Jaffe, this was not the best of everything. This was afterwards. She had written another book. And here comes Susan Kohner and her husband. And she bought my book, and I thought to myself, she's going to be fascinated because she's going to find out I wrote about her. That's such a funny... Anyway, that was the end of that. So.
Now, you actually wrote a New York Times article that was about all of this and how black do you have to be.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about penning that and the response to it.
Well, at age 37, and it was an era when you had to do that, I realized I was 3 years away from 40. And that's curtains for, not curtains, but downhill for a whole lot of people. I knew it didn't make sense since I was so limited in terms of, when like those of us who were considered too much looking like white, that we could not play anything but that one role. What it means is all kinds of things are taken off the table. It means that soaps, commercials, primetime television, and movies are all off the table as employment. The only thing that you're allowed to play, really, is theater. And fortunately for me, I'll go into the two great mentors of my lifetime in terms of theater further along. But I knew that it was time for me to start looking into something. So I took the GRAE, the graduate record exam. I took the GRAE, the graduate record exam, passed it to my shock and surprise, and I had crammed and crammed for it months and months and months and months, and then I got enough that it was time for me to, the very next week, start at Columbia University. And I read this article by a Robert Dallows, who was talking about, was complaining that somebody was hiring Percy, I forgot what his last name was, for Peyton Place. And he said, this is a guy with aquiline features. He looks like a black man in makeup, but he's not a real black man, and black people are going to be insulted because this means that Peyton Place is not really diverse because of, and I was furious. So I wrote, my sister said to me, well, why don't you write the New York Times? And I said, no, they only talk about people for about a paragraph. What I have to say is much more complicated than that. And so she said, let them do the editing. You write down what you want to say. Let them decide that it's too long. So I sat down and I wrote a 6-page letter called How Black. It wasn't called How Black Do You Have to Be. They inserted their own title. But I wrote some title, and I wrote this 6-page letter, and an incredible man called Seymour Peck happened to be the editor of the Arts and Leisure at the Times. He made it into a huge article. He paid me for it, and he would consider me a new voice, and he would, over time, have me write 7 more articles for the New York Times about black images in media. But this one took off so incredibly that he took 2 weeks from then, he took out a whole half-page Colors of Black and another whole half-page. So altogether it was a whole page of the letters. They started getting this tsunami of letters from people all over the place. They were painting a page full of letters. And black actors and actresses started calling me up and telling me the most incredible things about what they would do. I particularly remember, what was her name? Marlene Clark, I think her name was. Well, anyway, Marlene was her first thing. And I think it may have been a different last name. Anyway, she was one of Billy D. Williams' wives, one of his many wives. And she told me, gorgeous girl, she told me about them stuffing her cotton in her nostrils to widen her nose. And she said to them, how am I supposed to breathe? The things people started. Anyhow, this tsunami of letters just made the whole thing. And so he then went on to do the Colors of Black, to air all the things people had on their minds. And I was planning to leave the theater, but, I was planning to leave the theater. I had passed the
GRE.
The GRAE, the graduate work, and I was due. Somebody saw that article and got on a phone, and they got on the phone between the appearance of the article and Colors of Black. That altered my life completely. I had planned what I had hoped to be in that year, 1968, what I had hoped to become was I wanted to, and I passed the grade to do it, my master's in Columbia. I wanted to get to be the head librarian at an HBCU, a historically black college, so I could start teaching black kids their real history in this country, including things like the Black West and all the things that they don't know, the 200 slave rebellions that are kept out of our history books, so that they would understand that to be descended from slaves, as I am from both sides of my family, is a glory because of what we have done in this country. When I see kids who feel that's something to be ashamed of, it's distressing to me because it's something to be proud of. When you know what we have really done in this country and for this country. Because, well, we can go into that later. Anyway, that phone call would change my entire life.
Should we go into that now, or do you want to take a short break?
No, I think this is the place to take that break.
Okay, we'll take a short break then.
Yeah.